Hello again. The purpose of this video is to introduce you to Jerusalem so that you understand the way that it's laid out and the dynamics of the city so that you get the most out of it when you are there. Now, most major cities become important because they're on a trade route or a waterway, and that's not the case for Jerusalem. Although it plays a slight role in the route that crosses over the Judean highlands, Jerusalem's importance is almost exclusively due to its spiritual connections. There simply is no city like it. In order to get the most out of your time when you're in Jerusalem, it's important that we understand how it developed over the years and the way that it's laid out. So, in order to do this, turn to the map in your Israel Study Manual called Jerusalem Walls, and let's dive in. This map will help us focus on the ancient walled city of Jerusalem. The modern city has expanded 10 times just in the last 70 years. It's now a city of around 900,000. However, up until the late 1800s, there was virtually no city outside the old city walls. We're going to focus on the biblical city. It is relatively small. Don't draw this in, but make a mental note of it. It is only about 1,100 yards wide and slightly more than that from north to south, depending on which set of walls you're using. That is only about 1/3 of a square mile. Let's begin marking the map. From this point on, everything that gets shaded or outlined you can mark on your map. Remember, you can stop the video at any point to keep up with the markings. If you wonder about keeping an unmarked version of this map, it's also in the student map manual. Jerusalem is framed by two valleys. The Kidron Valley is on the east. It starts right next to Jerusalem and runs all the way to the Dead Sea. Jerusalem is just east of the watershed divides, so shade in this valley. The Mount of Olives is on the other side of the Kidron Valley, to the east. It's higher than Jerusalem, so it provides a good view over the city. The second valley that frames Jerusalem is the Hinnom Valley on the west and south as it curls around Jerusalem to join the Kidron Valley. One of our names for hell actually comes from this valley. The word Geh is the Hebrew word for valley, so we get the word Gehenna or Gehinnom, putting those words together, and it's related to what is noted in 2 Kings chapter 23 and how Josiah stopped the human sacrifices that were happening here. These two valleys are quite deep and have served quite well as a protective wall from attack. It makes the most vulnerable side the north side of Jerusalem. There's one more city that comes into play, and it runs through the middle of the old city today. It's called the Tyro Pian Valley, which means the Cheesemaker's Valley. No one really knows why it's called that, but that's what it's called. And while it runs through the middle of the old city today, up until Hezekiah's time, it really was a defining boundary of what Jerusalem was. Jerusalem was only on the eastern side of the Tyro Pian Valley. We'll talk more about that in a second. The original city of Jerusalem, originally called the Jebusite city, and the city that served as David's capital, is framed by the Kidron and the Tyro Pian valleys. It's also called the lower city on your map. It is often called David's city, but here we have to be careful because the biblical name, the city of David, actually referred to Bethlehem. When we're talking about Jerusalem, this small piece of land outlined here is called David's city. It's very small. When Solomon became king, he expanded the city to the north. On the rocky outcropping that had served as the threshing floor of Araunah in 2 Samuel 24, Solomon built the first temple. That was the site David had purchased. Forever after that, this site, a little north of David's city, is known as the Temple Mount. Between the Temple Mount and David's city, the lower city, Solomon built his administrative center and his palace, known as the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon, giving us some idea of the close ties with the Phoenicians and their building practices. It was actually twice as big as the temple structure. That area between the Temple Mount and David's city is called the Ophel, which simply means higher area. Now let's take a look at a picture. This is looking north, so east is to the right. Here's the Kidron Valley and the Mount of Olives, and here is where the Hinnom Valley would run. It is somewhat obscured by the angle of the picture. You can also see the Tyro Pian Valley, although it's less pronounced here. The lower city, or David's city, is the city that David captured and served it as capital, is right here. It's only about 70 yards wide. That's right, only 70 yards wide. Solomon expanded the walled city north to build the temple and his palace in the Ophel. We do not know the exact shape of Solomon's temple platform, so what you're drawing is a guesstimate. The primary source of water for both David's city and Solomon's city is the Gihon Spring in the Kidron Valley. When Judah was about to be besieged by the Assyrians under Sennacherib, Hezekiah determined to bring this water inside the walls, so he built a tunnel to do so. The blue and purple areas now marked are essentially the size of Jerusalem until the fall of Israel. The area across the Tyro Pian Valley only becomes part of the city when refugees from Israel settle here after the Assyrians crushed the northern country of Israel in 722 BC. Let's go back to the map. As you look at this, note David's city, then Solomon's expansion to the Temple Mount, then notice what is called the Upper City. This is the area that became inhabited in the 8th century after the fall of Israel. It has been part of the ancient city and the walled city of Jerusalem ever since. So this was the shape of the city in Jesus' day. Let's take a closer look at these walls. Here is where it can get confusing. Over the years, walls have been destroyed, then rebuilt, then destroyed, and rebuilt over and over again. Sometimes they use the same foundation, sometimes not. The red hash marks in this map show walls from different time periods. We're now going to outline them and label them from 3 different time periods. First, we're going to do this from Jesus' day. Here are the walls, or where the walls would have been in Jesus' day. Now, not all of this wall has been discovered, but what I have marked is the most commonly accepted location for the wall in Jesus' day. Take some time to highlight this wall carefully. It includes David's city, the lower city, and Solomon's expansion, but it also includes the upper city. By the way, the upper city became known as Mount Sion and is called that today. In 44 AD, about 10 years after Jesus, Herod Agrippa expanded the city wall north. It's called the Third Wall, and it actually goes off of this map. This is significant to note because when he expanded it northward, he then included inside the wall the place where Jesus was buried, which, according to Jewish rules, had to be outside the wall. We're not going to mark Herod Agrippa's walls, which, by the way, he never finished. The eastern side of the city is dominated by the temple compound, which Herod the Great expanded greatly from when it was rebuilt by Ezra and Nehemiah. More about this in a minute. On the north side of the temple platform, Herod built a large barracks for soldiers. This is called Fortress Antonio. It's actually higher than the temple and was built so that they could keep an eye on the activities going on in the temple. He named it for his friend Mark Antony. Herod the Great also built one of his 7 palaces in Jerusalem, in the upper city. The Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate, would have stayed in this palace when he went to Jerusalem. The compound actually had 2 palaces that mirrored each other, so Pilate would have stayed in one, and Antipas would have stayed in the other at Jesus' trial. So when Pilate sent him to Antipas, he was sending Jesus just simply across a courtyard. Now note 2 pools. First, the pool of Siloam at the south. That's at the south end of David's city. Hezekiah's tunnel poured the water from Gihon Spring into it. It comes into play in the events of John 7 and 9. The other pool is actually 2 pools. It's the pool of Bethesda, mentioned in John chapter 5. It's mentioned as the pool that had 5 porticos, 4 surrounding it and 1 across the middle of it, because it actually is 2 separate pools. In the Old Testament, the northernmost pool of these 2 is called the Upper Pool, and it's the site of Hezekiah's interaction with the Rabshakeh sent from Sennacherib in 2 Kings 18. Note, it is also outside the city walls in Jesus' day. Okay, now is where people get confused. In the 1530s, Suleiman the Magnificent, the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. Now, I'm going to highlight the old city walls that you'll see today, and these are the walls of Suleiman the Magnificent. They are marked in black here. But here's the catch. He included part of the city from Jesus' time, but not all of it. He included the Temple Mount, but Suleiman's architects built a wall westward, leaving out David's city and part of the upper city. Then they built north and included part of the city that was not in the city in Jesus' day. Take a moment to mark these walls. And remember, this is the location of the old city walls today. One final note. In the 19th century, a recent development, as the city was being resettled yet again, groups settled in one of 4 areas, and so the city of Jerusalem is divided into 4 parts. The Jews, the Jewish quarter, is around what could be seen from Herod's retaining wall of the Temple Mount, the western wall. The Muslims have what would have been the Temple Mount, where they have built their golden dome as the Muslim holy site. So the Muslim quarter is the ancient Temple Mount, now called the Haram esh-Sharif, and the area next to it. Christians settled near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And Armenian Christians lived near the Church of St. James and the seat of the Armenian Patriarch. Those are the 4 quarters of Jerusalem today. That's a modern innovation. Now let's focus for one moment on the temple area. You have these diagrams in your Israel Study Manual, so you can locate them and refer to them. Let's talk about the temple and the temple expansion. Ezra rebuilt the temple and Nehemiah the city wall, which would have included the wall around the temple area. He probably built the temple area on the same site that Solomon did, so there's probably overlap between Solomon's city and where Ezra and Nehemiah rebuilt. During the Maccabean period of Jewish independence in the 2nd century before Jesus, they built a fortress called the Acra. Then came the glorious builder, Herod the Great. He wanted to compete with the great structures of the Roman and Greek world, so he expanded the platform to be the largest open-air structure in the world in its day, larger than the Forum in Rome. He rebuilt the temple itself, but since he was not allowed to enter there, he also built a very grand structure called the Royal Portico or Royal Stoa on the south end of the platform. The large courtyard was used for general sale of merchandise, not just for the sale of sacrificial animals. It was this expansion that caused the need for the so-called barrier to be installed that provided the warning to non-Jews that they could pass no further into the temple area. It is this platform that exists to this day, and it supports the golden dome of the Muslim shrine. It is also worth noting that Herod built a bridge across the Tyro Pian Valley that connected the temple platform to the upper city where his palace was and where the very opulent houses of the priestly families were. This is a drawing that's also in your Israel Study Manual. Notice, this is where the western wall is. It's a small portion of the wall of Herod's platform. It looks like this. Now the temple and the top of the platform were destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, just as Jesus predicted. Over the years, around the top of the wall, there was rebuilt using smaller stones. In 691 AD, they built the Dome of the Rock, and this is a shrine, not a mosque. Also, they added El Aqsa the mosque in the 700s. It's been knocked down several times by earthquakes and rebuilt. Here's a picture looking from that same angle. Note the Temple Mount being outlined and the location of the western wall. Here is a model of Herod's temple compound. Note the royal stoa to the left, the temple platform, and the temple itself. You can see Fortress Antonio. You can also see the nicer homes in the upper city and where Herod's palace would be. Now, if we look at this model from the west, you can see Herod's palace better and where Pilate and Herod Antipas would have stayed in the days of Jesus' trial. So here you can see Herod's palace in the foreground, the temple in the background, and the expensive homes behind the palace. Notice there are two palaces and they mirror each other. Herod would have stayed in one, Antipas in the other, and when Herod sent Jesus to Antipas, he would have sent him across this courtyard to see Herod Antipas. So let's quickly walk through the incredible events of Jesus' last couple of days. Here's the outline of the city, and this would be the Temple Mount. The Kidron Valley is just to the east, and the Mount of Olives is on the eastern side of the Kidron Valley. There are two cities on the back side of the Mount of Olives, Bethphage and Bethany. Jesus came to Bethany on the Saturday before Palm Sunday. And on Palm Sunday, he would have gone from Bethany to Bethphage, where he got the donkey, crossed over the Mount of Olives, and rode into the praise of the people into Jerusalem. Every day he would travel back to Bethany to spend the night. On Thursday and Friday, he came into Jerusalem and things were different. On Thursday, he went to a room in the upper city where he had the Last Supper. At the close of the Last Supper, he went to the Garden of Gethsemane at the base of the Mount of Olives. That's where he was betrayed and arrested and taken to the high priest's home back in the upper city. Friday morning, they took him to the council house for a trial with the Sanhedrin, who then sent him to Pontius Pilate, staying in Herod's palace. There he saw Pilate, then Herod Antipas, and back to Pilate, who then sent him to be condemned to be crucified just outside the city walls, and it was near there that he was buried. I hope you feel more familiar with Jerusalem, and I hope you thoroughly enjoy your time there. God has done phenomenal things for us right in that site. It's where we were saved.